makes love so frighteningly grand, as the French writer François de la Rochefoucauld said 4 centuries ago. It is with true love as it is with ghosts. Everyone talks about it, but few have seen it. And yet, there are those who have seen both. Welcome to Haunted Love, with settings ranging from South Florida to South Korea. This is a rich collection of 17 tales that touch the heart and tinkle the spine. Chris Gonsalves, the co-author of Haunted Golf by Lions Press, first discovered the spirits of the undead while a newspaper reporter on the cobblestone streets of New Bedford, Massachusetts. Since then, he's gone on to edit national magazines. He lives on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. Copyright 2010 by Morris Book Publishing. While I read this book, I thought that I could color this page, which I printed from Crafting a Green World. It's lovely with those flowers around her head. It's a sugar skeleton. It's quite fitting for the haunted love. Let's open up my box. And while I do that, I'm going to begin telling you the tales. Our first story, called Thomas Rose, Leading Lady. There's a dapper gentleman strolling the sands of St. Pete, looking to welcome all comers to his luxurious seaside castle. When he fades into the mist, it becomes clear his hospitality has survived well beyond his death, and so has his love for a Spanish beauty. The newlyweds strolled slowly, hand in hand, in the sugar-white sand of St. Pete Beach. The sun was sinking into the Gulf of Mexico, and the new bride thought there couldn't be a more perfectly romantic spot on earth. The couple stopped to take in the view. She turned to her new husband to kiss him, and was startled by the sight of a lone figure moving briskly up the beach behind them. It was a man. In the fiery light of the tropical sunset, he seemed to be glowing. He was dressed from head to toe in white, from his Panama hat to his linen summer suit and polished white bucks. He seemed strangely out of place here on the beach, but even from this distance the young woman could see he was smiling. The sight of him, while unusual and unexpected, filled her with a feeling of peace. Did he just tip his hat to her? She tugged on her husband's arm. Honey, look at this strange guy coming this way. Her husband turned to follow her gaze and saw nothing. What guy? The young wife was aghast. The friendly-looking man, resplendent in his white summer finery, had vanished right before her eyes. Where he stood, there was nothing but sand and shells. He was right there, she shouted. He looked like Panama Jack, and now he's just gone. It's hot out here, her husband said. We've been out in the sun all day. We should head back to the hotel. She pouted. I saw him. I really saw someone. I know you did, my dear, he said, absently kissing her sunburned forehead. I'm sure you did. The couple trekked back to their hotel, which rose like a giant pink sand castle from just above the high-water mark of St. Pete Beach. The Moorish towers of the Don Cesar Hotel cast long shadows in the waning daylight. As they walked through the lobby, the woman pulled her husband over to the front desk. He cringed as she called the clerk over and launched into a detailed explanation of what she claimed she'd seen on the beach. All in white, crisp Panama hat, she told the clerk, and then he just disappeared. Yes, ma'am, the Don Cesar employee replied. He was polite but decidedly unexcited. I believe you saw Mr. Rowe, one of the greatest hoteliers in Florida history, I may add. He built the Don Cesar just as you see her now, and he is common sight around the property. Well, I don't know why, but he seemed so friendly, even though he disappeared before we could meet, the woman said. Would it be possible to make an appointment with Mr. Rowe and speak to him? Oh, no, ma'am, I'm afraid not. This hotel was built in 1925. Thomas Rowe himself died in 1940. I'm afraid you're about 50 years too late to have a chat with our Mr. Rowe. So you're saying that was what I saw out there? He was... Yes, ma'am, Thomas Rowe's ghost. But why us? The shaken young woman asked the inflappable desk clerk. Why would he be coming toward us? I imagine he wanted to make sure everything was to your liking, the clerk said. Really? Sure. Oh, and also, because you're in love. Mr. Rowe couldn't resist true love. Thomas Rowe's early life was far from a fairy tale romance. Born in 1872 in a hardscrabble industrial town in Massachusetts, he was orphaned at the age of 5 and sent to rural England to be raised by his grandfather. He grew to be a whip-smart, strapping young lad who eventually made his way to London, where he enrolled in college and immersed himself in the arts and theater. Before long, Thomas was a regular in London's opera houses. The performances, with their glorious costumes, amazing scenery, and brilliant music, captivated him. In the spring of 1892, some friends coaxed Tom into going to see a new production of Maritana, the light opera written by Irishman William Vincent Wallace, had been wildly popular for decades in England. It wasn't unusual to hear folks singing songs from Maritana on the streets. Do we need to see this old saw again? Tom asked his friends. Is there nothing more challenging for us to spend our time and precious coin on? But this is the new Maritana, one of Thomas's friends urged. This new cast of Spaniards is getting raves. Indulge us this once. Thomas conceded and the group made its way to the theater. As the opera began, the crowd settled in to enjoy the show. All except Tom, who seemed bored and distracted, shifting in his seat and fidgeting through the overture. Then the curtain came up and she appeared. All at once it was as though Thomas Rowe's world had stopped short. There was no sound, no cast, no orchestra, no crowd. There was just her, a stunning Spanish beauty with dark hair and darker eyes. When she began to sing, her voice was angelic. Here, in a loge-level seat at an opera he'd been reluctant to attend, Thomas fell helplessly, hopelessly in love. Who is that? He whispered to one of his friends. Who? The girl playing Maritana. That's Lucinda, one of the new Spanish cast. Isn't she fabulous? Fabulous, Thomas murmured, turning his gaze back to the stage. Fabulous indeed. He sat rapt for the remainder of the performance. When the curtain came down, his friends milled about getting ready to leave. But Tom wasted no time at all. He rushed to the door at the back of the theater and waited for this beautiful young heroine. After what seemed an eternity, she came out of the theater's rear stage door and into the London night. She was still in the guise of Maritana, the gypsy girl, her long brunette curls falling about her naked shoulders. In the gaslight of the city street, she was even more radiant than she'd been on stage. Tom approached her with the feigned confidence. I'm Thomas Rowe from America. I greatly enjoyed your performance tonight. I'm pleased to meet you, Thomas Rowe from America. Her English was perfect, tinged with just a hint of high-born Spanish accent. I am Lucinda. Would you walk with me to the cast quarters? With that, she took his arm, and the two walked the short distance to where she and the Spanish troupe were housed. They said nothing, but something powerful passed between them, because from that moment the dashing Thomas Rowe and the sultry Lucinda were inexorably connected. Tom attended nearly every performance of Maritana, and after a short time he professed his love for Lucinda and she for him. Every moment available to them was spent in moonlight meetings in a little-known English courtyard, where Lucinda played Maritana, and Roe became the opera's hero, Don Cesar. The couple stood against the courtyard's fountain and recreated Maritana's love story in their own words. Their love remained a secret, however, a forbidden thing. Lucinda's parents were Spanish aristocrats. Their plans for their daughter's future focused on culture and a career in the world of opera. She would tour internationally. She would be famous, rich, and adored by millions. Their plans certainly had no room for an American expatriate from a commoner's background. No matter how deep his infatuation for the beautiful young woman, the disapproval of Lucinda's parents was not enough to quell their clandestine meetings, however. With the rushing sound of the fountain as their musical score, they called each other Maritana and Don Cesar, and made plans to run away together when Lucinda's London performances were done. He promised her a pink castle of her own and a life of love and happiness. The night before the final performance of Maritana, the two met in the courtyard they now called their secret garden. "I will be here tomorrow night, my love," Thomas told her. "I've hired a carriage and driver to take us to Southampton and booked a passage on the next ship to America. When the final act is done, our first act begins. Meet me here and we'll away." "I will be here, my Don Cesar," Lucinda said. "Nothing can keep us apart. There is nothing so strong as our love." The following evening, Tom grinned as he passed the bustling crowd outside the theater. He skipped the performance and went directly to the tiny courtyard to await Lucinda, and there he waited. Hours passed. The carriage and driver waited impatiently outside the courtyard, and as the evening wore on and night turned to dawn, a dejected Thomas Roe realized his love would not be coming. Tom paid the driver his promised fare and dismissed him. Then the dejected young man made the long walk home, alone. The next day, friends who had attended the closing performance gave him the bad news. Lucinda's parents, suspicious that something was up between the young lovers, were waiting for her in the wings. They spirited her back to their country house in Spain and forbade her from contacting her American beau. Tom was heartbroken. He wrote to Lucinda constantly, but all of his letters were returned unopened. Lucinda's parents and their servants intercepted every letter and thwarted every attempt Tom made to reach out to his one true love. After several years of fruitless efforts, Thomas left London and returned to New England, where he threw himself into business and real estate development as a way to distract himself from his heartbreak. He was, by most accounts, a success, but all who were close to him knew there was a hole in Tom's heart that could never really be filled. That hole widened considerably in 1902, when Tom opened a single-looking letter postmarked from London. It was Lucinda's obituary. She'd taken ill shortly after they'd parted and never fully recovered, and now she was gone. She would never be his, at least not in this life. Attached to the obituary was a handwritten note from Lucinda, included by her father in response to her dying wish. It read, "Tom, my beloved Don Cesar, Father promised me he would deliver you my message. Forgive them both as I have. Never would I despair, never could I forsake you. We found each other before, and we shall do so again. This life is only an intermediate. I leave it without regret and travel to a place where the swing of the pendulum does not bring pain. Time is infinite. I will wait for you by our fountain to share our timeless love. Our destiny is time. Forever, Maritana." Tom laid his head on the massive mahogany desk and wept bitterly. From that day, Tom's robust health began to fail him. Tom's doctor, feeling the cold northeastern weather was wearing his patient down, suggested the tropical climate of Florida. "It'll be good for you, Tom. Get away from the drab, depressing winters. Give you a new, sunny perspective on life. It's what you need." Grudgingly, Tom heeded the advice. He could be miserable and lonely in the South, as well as anywhere else, he figured. In 1925, Thomas Rowe found St. Petersburg and began building a monument to his beloved Maritana. The Don Cesar was to be modeled after the Royal Hawaiian on Oahu, and would be the pink palace he'd promised to Lucinda years before. It was a massive undertaking, the first hotel built on a Florida Gulf Coast beach. He laid down $100,000 for 80 acres on St. Petersburg's Long Key. The 300-room hotel cost him $1.5 million to build, not including the special pink paint he commissioned from DuPont for the exterior. In the lobby, Tom painstakingly reconstructed the secret garden. Every detail of the cobblestone courtyard and the fountain that bore witness to his love for Lucinda was recreated in the hotel. The huge project had an obvious positive effect on Tom's health. He took to the role of tropical host, donning his signature white outfit and hat, and attending to the needs of his growing clientele. By 1928, tourists were flocking to the world-class hotel, known by regulars as the Don. An effusive host, Tom also became known as an equally gracious employer. He might never find true love again in this life, but he did get great satisfaction in making sure everyone around him was enjoying themselves. The first indication that Tom and Lucinda's love transcended the mortal plane came in 1929, just before the stock market crashed that presaged the Great Depression. Late one night, Tom awoke from a fitful sleep and felt the presence of his beloved Maritana. He never saw her, but he heard her voice whispering to him in the dark. "Be ready, my love," the voice whispered. "You can weather the storm if you prepare now." Based on the supernatural morning, Thomas squirreled away cash in secret vaults throughout the Don Cesar. The money sustained him and his staff during the worst of the financial turmoil of the 1930s. Re-energized, the Don placed host to countless celebrities: F. Scott Fitzgerald, Lou Gehrig, Ernest Hemingway, and Al Capone, all signed the guest register at the Don Cesar. Tom never stopped brainstorming for ideas for his pink palace. With business slow in March and April, he called his friends in New York and invited the Yankees baseball team to stay and train at the Don Cesar, making the team the first to engage in spring training in Florida. By 1940, Tom's health was failing again. He moved from his penthouse suite to room 101, right behind the reception desk. In the fall of that year, on a balmy afternoon, Thomas Rowe walked into the lobby of his hotel and stood beside his beloved fountain. He gripped his chest and fell to his knees. Employees rushed to his aid and helped him to his room. Bystanders swear they saw a wave of light in the shape of a young woman sweep into the hotel and follow the stricken man to his chamber. Within minutes, Tom was dead of a heart attack. The light hovered outside his room briefly, then returned to the fountain before disappearing completely. Since Thomas Rowe's death, the Don Cesar has been through good times and bad. In 1942, the U.S. Army purchased the Pink Palace, and the Don Cesar became a convalescent hospital for World War II pilots. Years passed, and eventually the government had no more use for the property. The Don Cesar became a derelict with boarded-up windows and barricaded doors. During the days the Pink Palace stood as an abandoned and dilapidated hulk, stories started cropping up of lights shining through boarded windows. The place was scheduled for demolition in 1972, but a St. Petersburg historical group rescued the Don from the wrecking ball and secured a multi-million-dollar grant for restoration. Even during the rehabilitation, Tom couldn't stay away from the place he called his own Taj Mahal, built for his long-lost love. Workers on the project were frequently approached by a friendly man in a white linen suit and a Panama hat. He asked them how things were progressing and gave them advice on certain repairs. And he always disappeared before anyone could ask who he was or how he had accessed the secured construction site. By 1975, the Don Cesar was once again open for business, but the return of business at the Don also brought about a resurgence of mysterious supernatural activity in the place. When a housekeeping staffer was cleaning the 5th floor, where Thomas once lived, she repeatedly heard knocking on the door of the room she was cleaning. After becoming irritated when she opened the door and no one was there, she went downstairs and found that all the other housekeepers were already gone for the day. No one else had been assigned to the 5th floor. Until the day she retired, the housekeeper refused to clean any room on that dreaded floor. One morning when dawn arrived and the sun began streaming through the eastern windows, the morning desk clerk found a guest asleep in a lobby chair. When the staffer approached, the guest awoke with a start. "I was asleep, and the shower just suddenly came on," the guest said. "I turned it off and went back to bed. Then the bathroom door started opening and closing. I got dressed and came down here. I'm not sleeping in any room with a ghost." When a veteran reservation clerk made her way down to the kitchen for a tray of cups and a pot of tea, she was shocked when upon her return, swinging doors opened before her approach. This incident was apparently repeated, and was even witnessed on more than one occasion. Perhaps Thomas Rowe was portraying the hotelier and gentleman he was in life, and helping another of his staff members. After the Don Cesar became listed on the National Trust for Historic Hotels in America, new ghost stories started circulating. Though smoking has long been banned in much of the hotel, workers and guests report the strong odor of menthol cigarettes. Tom smoked them until the day he died, on the advice of his doctor, who thought cigarettes would soothe Tom's persistent asthma and just lead to more problems, like a heart attack. One former executive came within a locked door from interrupting Tom and Lucinda in an intimate moment. As he approached his ground floor office on the south side of the Don Cesar, he clearly heard the voices of a man and a woman engaged in the kind of low banter unique to lovers. He froze in place, unsure whether to proceed or to run. After all, he had the only key to his locked office. He turned the lock and the lever's patter ceased. He heard the couple get up and leave the room, even though there are no other doors. He even heard the rustle of Lucinda's skirt as she rose to depart. Not only is the ghost of Thomas Rowe helpful to satisfied guests, but he can be abrupt with those who criticize the Don as well. Once, when a customer spoke harshly of the hotel's service to an employee in the hotel floral shop, all of the flowers in the cooler suddenly wilted in unison. Another woman who was nitpicking the hotel's culinary offerings found her skirt being pulled up and away from her. Only when she froze and stopped complaining did her garment fall back into place. Then there are the most persistent supernatural sightings. The visions of a young couple strolling the grounds and the 5th floor hand in hand at sunset. The man always wearing the traditional tropical weather white suit and Panama hat. The young, beautiful woman with the long, dark hair wearing a Spanish-style peasant dress. Those who believe say it's clear that Lucinda and Tom finally made a life together in the pink palace he built as her tribute. The couple are now free to roam Don Cesar's marble halls and manicured grounds together, sharing the afterlife. On to the next story. The Visit at Seaman's Bethel. In the fall of 1987, I was slugging it out as a city beat reporter at a smallish daily newspaper in the gritty port city of New Bedford, Massachusetts. I was also a part owner of a rapidly failing camera store. I'd gone in on the business with an old friend, a drive-time radio talk show host in the same town. We fancied that our celebrity status in the local media would make us a smash on the photography business. Turns out, very few people cared. I spent most of my days chasing car wrecks and fires and small-time political scandals. The camera store became a place to sit for 4 hours and write or make calls, or daydream about making it big someday at the Boston Globe. I had no idea what my partner Hal thought about during his 4 hours in the shop every day. Maybe a network radio or television gig. But he was old, much older than me. In fact, he was on his second quadruple bypass when I met him. It's possible he spent his shift just happy to still be alive. I never asked, and it's too late to ask him now, is it though? But while Hal was alive and I was still at least partially committed to the idea of entrepreneurship, one particular photographic feat that managed to attract most of the money we made back then. I'd built a platform surrounded by brilliant and quite expensive color-correct light bulbs. When you attached a camera to the mount, you had a crisp, undistorted view of whatever was laid on the platform. With that stand and the sophisticated Canon T90 Hal owned, we could take crystal clear pictures of pictures. Digital photography was in its infancy at this time, but because I had access to state-of-the-art workstations and software at the paper, I could not only make the quality of the copies better than the originals, I could also manipulate the images to remove flaws, distracting objects, and, more frequently, unwanted people. I was tired when I got to the camera store that morning in October 1987. I'd been in the newsroom most of the night, writing the story of a memorial service for 2 fishermen who'd been lost at sea a few weeks before. Family members had gathered in the Seamen's Bethel on New Bedford's Johnny Cake Hill to see the names of the lost men written on a new cenotaph, one of dozens that lined the walls of the Bethel, memorializing the dead who sailed from New Bedford Harbor and went to their final resting place in the sea. I'd interviewed a number of family members, including the captain's wife, a stern, stocky Portuguese woman who shared her memories of her husband in short bursts of broken English that sounded more like annoyance than grief. I thanked her and went back to look at the cenotaph, pretending to take notes. Actually, I just stared at the names and wondered what it must be like to be 100 miles offshore when 20 tons of steel-hulled trawler decides to head to the bottom of the ocean. It made me shiver. I waited in the chapel until most of the folks had gone. There were just a few staffers milling about. The Bethel was already 20 years old in 1851, when Herman Melville immortalized the place as the Whaleman's Chapel in his classic novel Moby Dick. In the same New Bedford, there stands a Whaleman's Chapel, and few are the moody fishermen shortly bound for the Indian Ocean or Pacific who failed to make a Sunday visit to the spot Melville wrote. It was no less true in 1987, though the trips were now to the rich fishing spots of the North Atlantic's Georges Bank, rather than to the whaling grounds of the Pacific. In the novel, Melville has the fire and brimstone pastor of the Seamen's Bethel preaching his sermon from a pulpit shaped like the bow of a ship. In fact, in the 19th century, the place looked pretty much like any other nondescript Puritan house of worship, right down to the plain, simple lectern. In 1961, a bow-shaped pulpit was added to match the description given in Moby Dick to keep from disappointing tourists. So I was still drowsy and only half paying attention in the camera store the next morning when a woman walked in and asked to speak to Chris. "That's me," I grunted. I looked up to see a rather striking older woman with flame-red hair and piercing green eyes. She was easily 65 years old, but she carried herself with all of the grace and elegance of the stunningly attractive woman she was accustomed to being her entire life. She was my grandmother's age, and yet I could feel myself blushing. "Chris, my name is Maureen. I was told by a good friend that you can do something wonderful things with old photographs. I was hoping you could help me." Her voice got softer and sadder with each word. This was some painful thing for her. "I'll do my best," I mumbled, unsure of where this was all going. She took a photo out of her handbag and slid it across the counter with one immaculately manicured finger. She wore a great deal of expensive-looking jewelry, but no wedding ring. She smelled of fine powder and lilacs. I looked down at the photo. What do we have here? It's me, a long time ago, she said, sounding a little defeated. Indeed, it was her. She was breathtakingly beautiful. She had a radiant smile. Given the clothes of the folks around her and the decorations visible in the background, the picture looked to be from the early 1960s. You'd like copies of this picture? I asked. It's more complicated than that, she said. She reached back into her purse and pulled out a clipping from the newspaper I worked for. When she unfolded it, I felt my knees go weak. It was the obituary for the lost fishing captain, the one whose memorial service I'd covered the night before. A blurry black and white picture of the captain stared back from the rough newsprint. It wasn't much of an image, as obituary photos go, probably some small detail from a larger family portrait. Despite that, the handsome old captain's square jaw and bright eyes, set off by a thick salt and pepper mustache, were plain to see. I thought about his frumpy widow, an odd couple to be sure. I wonder, Chris, if you could combine these two photos. You mean the picture of you and the obit from the newspaper? Exactly. I must have looked at her like she was stark raving insane, because she began to put the pictures back into her purse. She stopped and set them back on the counter with a long sigh, and started very softly, almost imperceptibly, to cry. I've never had to tell another living soul this, she said in a near whisper. There's no reason I should have to tell you. It's none of your business, but I will. I'll tell you anyway. This man you see here, this dead sea captain, this is the man I have loved all of my life. We have been lovers since before you were born, Chris. Can you understand that? He was married, he had his family, and I was his mistress, and now he's gone. I have nothing at all of his, not even one photo of us together. That's all I'm asking. I'm asking you to make me one photo with us together that I can have. It finally became too much. She slumped over the glass doorcase and began weeping loudly and deeply. Here she was, a woman who had lost the man in her life but couldn't go to the funeral. She couldn't follow the family to the commercial pier to see the flowered wreath thrown into the sea in remembrance. She couldn't attend the memorial service at the Seamen's Bethel to hear the bell tolled in his honor and to see his name on the cenotaph. She couldn't mourn, she couldn't grieve, until this very moment in my camera store. She cried like that for close to 20 minutes. When she finally raised her head, the glass case and the newspaper clipping were soaked with her tears. I handed her a handkerchief, and she dabbed at her eyes with it. I'm so sorry, she said. I'm sorry as well, ma'am. I'm very sorry for your loss. The acknowledgement of her grief washed a calm over her. We talked for almost an hour about how they'd met, where they'd been, and how her love deepened, even though she had him to herself only part of the time. She said she figured nobody would ever understand that. I told her she was probably correct. She looked down at the ruined clipping of the obituary. I'll need to get another copy of the paper, she said. Actually, I work at the newspaper, Maureen. I can get as many copies of that obituary as you want. But here's the thing, I'm not going to be able to make a very good composite of your color photo with this tiny newsprint picture. Surely you understand that. My friend says you do excellent work, Chris. I trust you to do your best. She pulled out a crisp $100 bill from her purse and pushed it to me with the same elegant finger. I'll leave this with you as a deposit. When shall I call you? I had no idea how I was going to begin this project. Tell you what, Maureen, leave me your number and I'll call you just as soon as I have something to show you. If it's progressing the way you want, fine. If you don't like the quality, I'll give you your pictures and your money back. I was banking on the latter. She agreed and gave me her number. Then she floated out of my store as quietly as she'd entered. I'd never see her again. Later that evening, I went to the paper to work the night shift, and right away started rummaging through the old papers to get a clean copy of the captain's obituary. The managing editor letter surprised me in the old newspaper archive, affectionately known as the morgue. "Gonsalves, I have a sweet job for you," he yelled. That usually meant some boring assignment or some menial office task. In this case, the latter. "We fired the office assistant today," he went on. "Turns out she wasn't doing anything except chatting with her sister and doing her nails. Here." He thrust an overstuffed manila envelope at me. "What the hell is this, Chief?" I asked. "I have other things to do here, you know." "Yeah, well, add this to your list. The girl wasn't mailing the obit photos back to the families. We've got a month's worth of sacred family heirlooms here. I'm trusting you to get these mailed out, so I don't have a whole bunch of grieving relatives storming my office looking for their snapshots. Got it?" My mouth had gone dry. Did he say a month's worth of obit pictures? Was it possible I was holding an envelope that contained the original glossy color picture of the dead sea captain? If I was, I knew I'd be able to make a spectacular composite for my customer, the mysterious mistress. I was thinking now how handsomely she might pay for such a piece of work. Meanwhile, my boss was expecting an argument. I disappointed him. "Sure thing, Chief," I said. I ran from the morgue back to my desk to see what was in the folder. I found it easily. It was the 11th picture from the top, just as I'd suspected. The obituary photo had been cropped from a larger professional family portrait. In the sharp color print, the captain stood with that same broad smile, his arm draped over the shoulder of his wife, the woman I'd met at the memorial. They had 3 sons who favored their father, and in this picture the sparkle in his eyes was set off by the craggy, withered look of his handsome face. He looked every bit a man of the sea. Did he also look like a man who would enjoy the company of a gorgeous flame-haired mistress? Well, I suppose he did. It would have been easy to simply take the photo back to the camera store for a day, shoot a copy of it, and then mail the original back to the rightful widow. But I was in a quandary. Should I use the property of the man's wife to make a photo for his mistress? Fate, or something like it, had set the thing in my hands, but what was I prepared to do with it? I decided to take the photo with me for a walk in the cool autumn air. New Bedford at night can be a glorious place. The lights begin on the horizon with the greens and reds of the buoys at sea, and continue up past the gas lamps of the docks. My shoes clicked and clacked over the stones as I trudged up Johnny Cake Hill and stopped in front of the Seaman's Bethel. It didn't occur to me until I got to the front door that this was where I was headed. In those days, the doors to the Bethel were always unlocked. There was always one lone light on the inside for anyone who needed to pray for protection, or in my case, guidance. I walked in and sat in the pew closest to the cenotaph that bore the name of the sea captain whose photograph I held in my hand. What happened next was so powerfully surreal that the memory of it is as if it happened to me in a childhood dream, foggy, distorted, and far away. I was sitting on the edge of the pew with my head bowed forward. I had my eyes closed. That's when I felt it, like a cold wind pushing at my back. I felt hollowed out as this force rushed and glowed inside me. It was lifting me out of the pew. There was no pain, but there was an overwhelming sense of confusion and frustration. I was completely disconnected from the reality of the Bethel. I was now engaged in some sort of communication with this force that had gotten inside me. It struggled to find its voice to speak to me. I could feel its desperation as it tried to bridge the divide between us. Yes. I heard it say the word. I felt it say the word. I understood it. The energy became calmer and more focused. Yes, and shortly after that, soon. Yes, and soon. The energy rushed back out of me and I fell in a heap on the back of the pew. I tried to get my bearings. As I did, I noticed one of the Bethel's hymnals was on the pew next to me. It hadn't been there before, I was certain. I'd have seen it. The book was sitting there on the seat facing me, open to hymn 241. "'Tis midnight, and on Olive's brow the star has dimmed that lately shone. 'Tis midnight in the garden now, the suffering Savior prays alone." I stuck the picture of the captain and his family in that page, picked up the book, and left the Bethel. The next day I got to the camera store early. Before I set up the copy stand, I decided to call Maureen. to tell her I'd come across the original photo of the captain, but mostly I wanted to find a way to mention the encounter I'd had at the Bethel. I wasn't going to tell her in detail, of course, but I did want to know what these words "yes" and "soon" might mean. I dialed her number. A man answered. When I explained who I was, he told me that Maureen had been taken to the hospital the previous day with a high fever, kidney problems, he said. It was nothing serious. The doctors wanted to keep an eye on her, that's all. She'd be home in a few days. I thanked him and hung up. I got to work on the photos, shooting multiple exposures of both pictures so I could match the light in the final composite. I developed the film and waited. When I looked at the negatives on the light table, I saw I had everything I'd need to make a nice keepsake. A few more hours on the computer, and by the end of the day, I had what appeared to be a beautiful, candid snapshot of Maureen and the captain. In the picture, they were side by side, smiling broadly in a way they never could be in public. I made a half-dozen 8x10 prints, brought them back to the camera store, and set them in the pickup bin in an envelope marked with her name. By now, I could see some of the shortcomings in the composite, of course. The two people weren't in precisely the same scale. The background transferred harshly from the party scene in her photo to the portrait backdrop in his. More important, the shadows were at slightly different angles on their faces. Still, all in all, I thought my customer would be pleased. The next morning I called her again. Her brother answered. Things had changed. Her fever wasn't coming down. She was going to be hospitalized for a few days. I was disappointed. Just before I left the shop for the day, the words "yes" and "soon" kept creeping back to me. What could they mean? I took Maureen's envelope out of the bin and removed one of the prints. It seemed subtly different. Perhaps it was just the light, or maybe I'd been looking at the image too long. But it really looked like the difference in scale of the two photos had somehow been resolved. They looked more natural now. I waited 5 days before I called Maureen's number again. Her brother sounded tired and distraught. His sister had a staph infection, he said. Her fever was raging. It didn't look good. I was dumbstruck. She'd been one of the most lively-looking women to ever grace my little camera store. I took her photos out again to look at them. This time there was no doubt at all about the change. It was no trick of light or error of perception. Not only were Maureen and her captain in perfect scale, but the distorted background had been smoothed and warmed into a perfectly unobtrusive background. It was beyond my level of skill as a graphic artist to have accomplished what I saw in all 6 prints in the envelope. What was happening? Yes, soon. Where was this leading? I thought about the hymnal that wound up beside me in the Bethel. A weekend came and went. I took to calling Maureen's house daily, but now there was no answer. I called my contacts at the local hospital, and they said she'd been transferred to a hospital in Boston. They didn't know which one. By Saturday of that week, I was working the late shift again at the paper, helping out a buddy of mine on the copy desk, checking page proofs for the early edition. I scanned the obit page and my heart sank. There she was, Maureen, my customer, the captain's mistress. She was dead. I'd never get to show her the photo I'd made for her. She'd never get to see a happy image of her and her lover together. And then it struck me. Yes, soon. I read her obituary to the end. It politely avoided the matter of her never having been married. It concluded that she was survived by her brother Francis and her loving daughter, Olive. "'Tis midnight, and on Olive's brow is born the song that angels know, unheard by mortals, and the strains that sweetly soothe the Saviour's woe." The camera store was closed on Sunday, but I went in and opened up anyway. I grabbed Maureen's envelope, not sure what I'd find there. The images were now stunning in their clarity. Scale, background, and even the shadows matched. There was nothing about these prints that would betray them as a composite. In fact, I'm no longer sure they really were a composite. I put the prints together in a fresh envelope and took them with me when I left the store. Monday, I left work at 2 p.m. and drove to the funeral home where Maureen's wake was being outlined. I spotted her immediately as I stood waiting in the receiving line beside the casket. She had her mother's red hair and delicate features, but she had the captain's bright eyes. "Olive," I asked, holding out It's from your mother. She wanted you to have these. I gave her the envelope with the prints. Should I open this now? She asked. Soon, I said. I smiled at her and then I left. I'll never know how she felt when she took out the copies of the only photo in the world of her mother and father together. In fact, I don't even really know what she saw when she looked at those prints. Was it the same thing I saw? I wasn't even sure what that was anymore. I hope you enjoyed listening to this and watching while I colored the picture. I hope, as always, you're taking care of yourself and sleep well.